Esta séptima sesión de la Convención Nacional de Intérpretes, la tercera del día de hoy. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Les recuerdo que estarán activos los distintos canales, pero que no, salvo el de español, pero los demás canales estarán ocupados por intérpretes que aspiran a convertirse en miembros del Colegio Mexicano de Intérpretes de Conferencias. Si alguno de ustedes lo quiere escuchar para darles su retroalimentación y en su caso darles su aval, están bienvenidos a hacerlo y después les podemos decir el nombre de la persona que está en el idioma que hayan ustedes escuchado. Tenemos entonces los distintos idiomas en la parte inferior izquierda por todos los canales. Gretchen no sé si va a hablar en español o en inglés, pero la interpretación solo será español-inglés y después, pero saldrá en todos los canales menos en el de español. Sin más, quisiera yo agradecerle muchísimo a Gretchen haber aceptado esta invitación y estar con nosotros en este tema que a todos incumbe. Gretchen ha centrado su labor en temas de derechos humanos de los migrantes y refugiados desde 1995. Ha trabajado con casos de asilo político en El Paso y Seattle y entre 97 y 2005 fue la coordinadora jurídica de Sin Fronteras, una organización no gubernamental mexicana. En Sin Fronteras creó un programa de representación legal para migrantes y un proyecto para migrantes detenidos. Actualmente dirige el Instituto para las Mujeres en la Migración y MUMI, del que es cofundadora. El propósito de esta organización es que las mujeres vinculadas a la migración tengan los recursos necesarios para aprovechar los aspectos positivos de la migración, acceso a información y los derechos que las protejan de las posibles consecuencias negativas, así como los recursos para permanecer en sus comunidades de origen, si así lo desean. Muchísimas gracias, Gretchen. La palabra es tuya y al final tendremos una sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Pueden ustedes escribir sus preguntas en el chat que está en uno de los iconos del lado derecho o al final pueden solicitar la palabra dando clic en la parte inferior derecha de su navegador. Muy bien, muchísimas gracias. Adelante, Gretchen.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to speak in English today, and I'm going to share a presentation with you about climate change, gender, and migration. So I'm going to try to share the screen now. Thank you for bearing with me. As you can see, I'm in the woods. Okay, let's see. Okay, so the screen should be shared now. And can everyone hear me? Are we okay? Should I just start?
Yes, please start. We can hear you. We can see your presentation. Everything's working fine.
Okay, let me know if anything changes.
I will.
Thank you. Okay. So thank you, Gonzalo, for the presentation, and thank you for being here. The name of my presentation is Climate Change, Migration, and Gender. And the reason I wanted to speak about this today is that I think that there's a lot of terminology that's coming up in different areas, especially concerning climate change. And we'll be seeing a lot more of conversation, both at a national, local, and international level on issues that intersect between climate change, migration, and then also the specific interest in how climate change in particular affects women or people of different genders in different ways, and also affects people's ability to migrate, their need to migrate, and also the ways that they migrate. So I hope that you learn with me, because this is a new topic for us at the Institute for Women and Immigration, which is where I'm working currently. Okay, so we're going to talk about migration and climate change, some of the different definitions, and I included some terminology here so that you could also think about different ways to translate some of this new terminology. And we'll talk about climate change and migration patterns. Who are the actors involved in these different issues, mostly at an international level? Then, because we work from a legal framework, I think it's important to talk about the international policy, and in the context that we're working in anyway is the US and Mexico. And then we're going to talk a little bit about gender and migration just in general, and then do a case study in Honduras, in which we'll bring in a little bit about just looking at how climate change in Honduras in particular has affected women and also has caused many of them to migrate. And then toward the end, we're going to, if I have time, maybe not, just go over a little bit about how the mental health is affected by climate change. And I'm actually feeling it myself right now because I'm in the northwest of the United States, and there are huge wildfires. So this is the first time that I've ever actually been in a beautiful, pristine place that I've been coming to for over 40 years, and now it's completely full of smoke. So I really feel that this is apropos to what is actually occurring and which will be occurring and affecting all of our lives. Okay, so I wanted to start with this quote by Patricia Espinosa, who is the UN Climate Change Executive Secretary. And she says, human migration precipitated by environmental and climatic changes can be traced back to the dawn of human civilization. Climate change is the single biggest threat to life, security, and prosperity on the earth. And so I think that we all know that the situation with the earth and climate change is going to be the biggest probably issue in the next decades as we move forward. And right now, I think that we're stuck, still worrying about the pandemic and the economic changes, but really underneath a lot of all of this is the issues that we've been, leading to the destruction of the earth through environmental degradation. So understanding climate, environmental migration, it's always multifaceted. It's always mixed with other causes, dynamics, and social determinants. And all areas and populations are not equally affected nor vulnerable. And the other issue that we have to think about is data collection. There's so much more data collection than there used to be, but still, data collection around the intersection between environmental migration or around climate change and migration is difficult, and it's also incipient. Okay, so some of the definitions that we've been looking at is climate change, the rapid warming from human activities, primarily from burning fossil fuels. Migration in itself, what is it? What's a good definition? And we've selected this one of the movement of people from one place to another with the intention of settling either permanently or temporarily at a new location. And then climate environmental migration. So that's when we're starting to put the two things together. When people choose to or are obliged to leave their habitual place of residence because of a sudden or progressive change in the environment due to climate change. And then internally displaced people or persons are people who are forced to leave their homes, but they remain within their country's borders. And we're using this definition a lot too, because what we're seeing in terms of climate change and migration is that lots of times people are displaced internally first before they decide to cross over the border or to leave their country. And then an international migrant doesn't really have a formal definition, but always includes somebody who has crossed over a border, changed from their country of usual residence to another country, irregardless of whether it's an irregular movement or whether they're moving with a visa or for work or for whatever reason. Okay, so let's look a little bit at the effects of climate change. Since 2009, 24 million people each year are displaced due to the effects of climate change. And since 1980, 258 weather or climate disasters have occurred that, some people have started looking at what is the economic impact, right, of the degradation to the earth. And so we can look at these kind of figures and see that because of climate change and because of all the disasters, that's been equal to approximately $1.75 trillion. Okay. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is looking at these 6 different areas. One is global warming, one is sea level rise, one is floods, which just over the summer, we've seen all of the floods in Germany and Belgium and other parts of Europe and China, glacier, sea and land ice melt, droughts and desertification, and extreme weather and climatic events. Okay, so just in terms of context, because sometimes we start to get panicked, that where did this come from all of a sudden? It's not all of a sudden. Both migration and also environmental changes have been occurring since the beginning of time. That's part of human life on this planet. And the historical method of coping with these changes have to do with the resources that we have, what food is available, what the physical terrain is like, and also the climate and the weather. So we have 2 different ways of adapting. One is in situ adaptation, which is I can change something within my home, maybe. I can rebuild. I can put my house up on stilts. I can change the types of crops that I'm growing to adjust to the cyclical, weather changes, or a physical relocation. Because of what's going on, I have to relocate. Okay, so some of the projections by 2050, some of the different studies that have come out have pointed to 143 million people who could be internally displaced by certain types of climate change induced events. Such as water insecurity, and then also accounting for all events, 200 million people could be displaced. And those are studies that have come out of the World Bank. And you can see here, I tried to put up some diagrams too, because I don't know if when you're interpreting, it's helpful to see the words and how the different subjects or the different issues are connected. So the climate, such as drought, crop failure, poor natural resource management, can then lead to conflict, right? There's conflict over scarce resources. We're already seeing this in some cases in terms of, conflict over land, when part of the land has already been covered by the ocean, or we're seeing it in terms of lack of water when there's been severe drought, conflicts over water, just demographic pressures in the destination area. And that conflict can lead to internally displaced persons, and then to asylum seekers, or what we're calling climate refugees, or economic migrants. Okay, so this is just a chart that shows the number of IDPs by disasters as of the 31st of December 2020. And here you can see that there are more than 7 million people who are living in displacement as a result of disasters in 104 countries and territories. And I'm just looking at this. You can see actually that people are moving and being displaced more, according to this chart, more in the United States than they are in Mexico and Central America, which is in our region. And then the highest amount, or the number of people who are being displaced by disasters, it looks like is in Afghanistan. So one of the things that we've been learning is that you can have more people who are being displaced by climate change, but the more resources the country has, the better infrastructure that the country has, the easier it is for people to adapt. So you could have, more impact, more disasters, but really less impact on the people because there's more support, more infrastructure. There's the government is helping. There's more places for them to go, etc. Okay, and then the other concept that is interesting, I think, to learn is the difference between these rapid onset events or slow onset events. So the rapid kind of event is the floods, the tornadoes, earthquakes, tropical storms, hurricanes, or I would add, since I'm living it right now, the wildfires. One day everything is fine, and the next day you have to, run and leave your home. So that's a rapid onset event, as opposed to these slow events that we've known about, for years and years or decades, which are events that gradually develop over time. They're more difficult to see. For example, we know that the sea is rising, but if you go to the beach, it's not always so obvious to see. Droughts and water scarcity, if you're in a particular place, then you can feel it or you can see it, or you're having trouble accessing water. But if you're not, then you don't have any sense at all. Desertification occurs slowly over time. Ocean acidification as well. Extreme temperatures. There have always been droughts. There have always been certain summers that are a lot hotter than other ones. But then what we can see is that over time, the temperature of the earth is going up, and in specific places, it's going up much more than in others. Air pollution, which is something that we have lived with for a long time in Mexico City. Rain and loss of biodiversity. Okay, so the way that people are being most impacted by climate change in this intersection between climate change and migration so far has been through tropical storms and floods. We're looking at approximately 99 million people who are affected annually by flooding, and 39 million people who are affected annually by tropical storms and cyclones. Also, the second issue is drought and desertification, and then the sea level rising. And there we can see, I think in Alaska, I don't know where all of you are, but certainly you could have been to or seen in the news, in the newspapers, etc., that there are certain parts of Indonesia and other places that are already having island disappearance and coastal erosion, and even just in the last couple of months with the building that fell in Miami. One of the things that people are saying is that that's due to climate change, because it's not just that the structure was being eroded because of the ocean coming up in and of itself. It's that it's built on a certain type of rock that's porous, and so when there's sea level rising, it comes up through the bottom of it. So you can put up as many seawalls as you want to, but if it's limestone and the ocean is coming up slowly through the ground, that's much more difficult to mitigate. Okay, so we have this rapid onset and short-term internal displacement. When you have rapid onset, it's not likely to instigate long-term or long-distance migration. For example, there's a hurricane or there's a tropical storm, and people go to higher ground. They leave for a time. The storm is over, and then they rebuild, and they continue to live there. With the slow onset or long-term, you look for the time for the consideration, preparation, and planning, and the likelihood of international rather than domestic changes. So it depends on what's happening in each specific country at any given time. And then the considerations for policy implementation, depending on whether it's rapid onset or whether it's slow onset. With slow onset, we should be able to be more proactive. And with these short-term, immediate rapid onset events, you would also think that each year we would know now in Central America, for example, there are going to be these tropical storms, that each year it's displacing more and more people, and there would be some way to plan for it. But the way that we need to understand the patterns and the trends should lead to better policy implementation. Okay, so this is another chart that I included just to look at new displacement by disasters and breakdown by hazards from 2008 through 2020. And here's wildfires. I was wondering why they didn't include wildfires. So we have floods, storms, earthquakes, wildfires, droughts, volcanoes, extreme temperatures, and landslides. And we can see that the floods and the storms are having the greatest impact in terms of affecting people in terms of internal displacement, and then also probably international migration. Okay, so that's just a really basic overview of some of the language and the way that the issues are being framed. And now it's important to talk about who are the actors, like who's involved in this issue, who's working on it, who's developing the data, the reports, and who is working on an international level so that climate change can be faced and also hopefully mitigated and reversed. So some of the actors at the UN level, there's a United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. There's an intergovernmental panel on climate change, which produced some of the information that I put at the beginning of the presentation. Then the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, the UNHCR, has been working on the intersection between climate change and climate refugees. And as we'll see a little bit later in the presentation, the definition of refugee in the 1951 Convention on Refugees doesn't really fit in terms of climate refugees. And so at the international level, they've been trying to look at the definition and see how people could be considered refugees under that definition, whether that definition needs to be changed or whether there needs to be some kind of alternative protection mechanism for people who are having to flee due to climate change. The World Bank is working on it, the Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. It's part of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, and that's who's focusing on it within the United Nations is the UN Development Program, the UNDP. And then we also have other organizations within the UN system that are working on it. But I think that the most important work being done on it is through the Framework Convention and the Intergovernment Panel, where they're looking at these intersections. And there's another, I didn't put this up here, but there's a global compact on migration and a global compact on refugees as well at the UN level. And both of those also contain information in policy recommendations for states that include the intersection between climate change and migration. Okay, so I included this as well because I think it's interesting to see, where, in what sectors are really, the ones that are most leading to the climate change. And then also in terms of different countries, what percentage of responsibility in terms of CO2 emissions from fossil fuel are, the different countries are putting out. So in terms of the global greenhouse gas emissions by economic sector, it's more divided than I would have thought. I thought that most of it would be energy, but also it's electricity and heat production. Look at agriculture, forestry, and other land use, transportation, and then just industry in general. And then if we look on this side, it's also divided in a way that I thought would have been a little bit different. So right now, China is responsible for 30% of CO2 emissions, So that's one of the reasons why it's so important for China to be part of and to be on board with climate change mitigation and the end to the use of fossil fuels. And then you can see some of the other countries. The United States, for example, I think represents about 4% of the world population, but it's responsible for 15% of CO2 emissions. So it's not very disaggregated, but you can get a general idea. And then Mexico would be somewhere in here in the other. Okay. So in terms of the legal framework, this is something that's, interesting to us because we work with women, migrants, and refugees, and a lot of them are from Haiti and Central America, which are countries that not only have political violence and then weak, structures in terms of government structures, but there's also been a lot of pressure in terms of climate change. In Haiti, they had both the earthquake in 2010 and then tropical storms. And as probably you saw last November, Honduras, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, some in El Salvador, were hit, really strongly by 3 tropical storms, Laura, Eta, and Iota. I don't know how you say that in English. Iota, Ida, Eta, and Laura. So we're looking at now, if somebody arrives in Mexico and says to us, I'm a climate refugee. I moved because my house was destroyed and I had no place to go except to leave the country. How are we going to handle that? How are we going to get immigration documentation for that person? So let's look a little bit at that. Oh, and first of all, I included this slide because I thought it would be interesting for you as interpreters that we're having all of these issues with semantics because this is a new area, it's a new intersection. So we don't really know what to call, what label to put on what's happening. So it's being called an environmental migration, climate change induced migration, ecological environmental refugees, climate change migrants, environmental migrants, climate refugees, and then environmentally displaced people. So we've been looking a lot, kind of like at the international documents. And I think that one of the advantages of using the term, for example, environmental refugee, is that the term refugee within the word itself implies that the person had to flee because some kind of internal disruption. Under the Refugee Convention, it's persecution because of the person's political opinion, because of their nationality, because they're indigenous. And it's not because of environment or because of climate change. That's not included in there. But there is this sort of like catch-all, which is social group. And so some people are looking at trying to fit in environmental refugees into the social group grounds of the refugee definition. Okay. And then this slide, we try to distinguish, between the types of reasons or the level of will or voluntariness with which people are leaving the country. So if you're in a refugee-like situation, you have a very low level of control over the whole process and a very high degree of vulnerability. For example, I'm in Honduras, the tropical storm hit, I lost my house, I have no job anymore. I've been told this a lot recently. I lost my job during the pandemic and I lost my house during the tropical storm. So if you're left with absolutely nothing and the government is not stepping up to help, then you have very low control over the situation and a very high degree of vulnerability. Then there's environmentally driven displacement. It's compelled, but it may be voluntary. I know that things are going to get worse, and I know that I'm going to have to leave. That you have less control and more vulnerability than just a regular migrant that decides to go and maybe try out a new job in another country. But at the same time, you're not absolutely in a refugee-like situation, because you might be able to find a safe place within your own country. And then there's this whole migration category where you have more control over the process. Okay, in terms of the international framework, there are currently no binding international agreements pertaining to climate migrants. So there's no international convention that discusses how states have the obligation to take in, for example, climate refugees, or to protect them. We do, I did mention these. The Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration does mention the issue of climate migration, as does the Global Compact for Refugees, but there's no specific framework. So what we're doing at the organization where I work in Mexico is looking at alternative frameworks. In the US, what they've been doing is trying to use something that's called TPS. It's temporary protected status. So with this temporary protected status is, like it says, a temporary immigration status that can be granted on the executive level on a discretionary basis. But, you know, it's also political, and different administrations have been more willing or less willing to use temporary protected status for specific nationalities. So it's not perfect, but it's something that already exists, already includes the issue of climate change. I mean, it does mention, you know, climate disasters or environmental disasters. And so that's something that they're working with. And now that the Biden administration is in, I'm sorry, I have flies here. The Biden administration is changing U.S. policy toward migration. It's something that they will probably add specific countries such as El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala to the TPS list. Okay, in Mexico, we have the Cartagena Declaration on Refugees, and it's not perfect, but it's much broader than the 1951 Refugee Convention. And here it has this, you know, this broad definition of refugee. It doesn't mention specifically climate migrants, but it does mention generalized violence or generalized insecurity. And so often, you know, these climate change events will lead to insecurity. So you can make the connection between generalized insecurity and the need for protection in another country. Okay, so that's sort of where we stand in terms of the international framework of states having to protect people who are fleeing from climate events. And now I'm going to move to the third issue, which is gender. And we're going to see how we can then mix all of them together and look at the connections between climate change, migration, and gender. So how does gender impact vulnerability in general, adaptability, and the decision to migrate? Okay, so one of the ways that we framed it is by looking at gender insecurity. So it just in general, and this is across the board, across countries, across nationalities, women are most susceptible to geographical, cultural, and political changes. They are often socioeconomically disadvantaged. They make less money. And then culturally and politically, they have fewer rights. They don't have as much representation within government. And then, of course, different cultural norms. So climate change, just like any other you know, major issue on the international agenda, is not a gender-neutral phenomenon. There are pre-existing gender dynamics and inequalities that are exacerbated by environmental effects of climate change. So I'm trying to think of some examples that we've had. For example, in the dry corridor in Central America, people who are in that corridor often working in agriculture. And sometimes when they are not able to continue to produce a certain crop, or they are no longer able to produce any crops at all, then they need to leave. And usually the first person to leave is the man in the family. And so that leaves women behind, often taking care of children and then depending on some kind of remittance or other sort of income that's coming from either working in another place or just trying to get by or waiting for money to arrive from the person who had to leave. And then we've also seen that then after the man gets established in one of the cities, then they join him. But that leads to other types of situations in which women then have to work in the informal sector or in domestic work. So there's kind of this chain that we've been able to identify in the cases that we've had so far. Okay. It's also, women are affected differently by the different opportunities or the lack of opportunities that are available to them, the different kinds of social networks that they have or that they don't have, and what's allowed or frowned upon within their society. And there are also environmental push factors that are directly tied to the socially conditioned responsibilities that men and women have in their communities. So this is what I was explaining, that men are often culturally expected to leave and work while the women stay behind. Okay, so these are some of the factors to consider when you're looking at vulnerability, and it doesn't have to be between men and women, but different groups of people. It could be children too, to establish the level of vulnerability or their ability to cope. So we look at their control over access to land and natural resources, economic capabilities, their income, do they have access to credit? Oftentimes it's much easier for men to have access to credit than it is for women. Their level of education, their dependency, what level of dependency do they have? And of course, if you have, tiny little children that you are responsible for, your dependency level is going to be higher. Do you have good health? What are your physical capabilities or disabilities? Level of personal autonomy and mobility in general, and then also household entitlements. So those are just some of the factors that we can use to determine the level of vulnerability that women have, or different groups, vulnerable groups have, vis-a-vis or other types of groups within a specific country. Let's see. Okay, so I'm just looking for some of the examples. For example, in water collection, women are often in charge of water collection. So women in 8 of every 10 households are responsible for water collection. And this just looks at the amount of time that they spend trying to make sure that the family has water to drink, to cook, to clean. And so if they don't have water, then the women are going to be affected. And this is very common in developing countries, in which, for example, women have to walk long distances in order to collect water every day. Okay, so all of these different issues have an impact on the decision to migrate, the level of vulnerability, the exposure and sensitivity of groups or individuals to different stresses as a result of the impact of climate change, which then can make them more susceptible to migration due to their low levels or absence of capacity to adapt. So we're looking at adaptation. So this goes back to also the amount of assistance that you have from a particular state or from your community, or from international cooperation. And what we're seeing is that in developed countries, there's so much more capacity to be able to adapt. So maybe in China, we saw the floods this summer just recently, and that's probably going to have a devastating impact on many people for a long period of time. Whereas perhaps the infrastructure that was devastated within Germany, within Belgium, yes, it's going to have a huge impact on a large group of people, but they also probably have insurance and they have a government that's going to help them rebuild. So they're much more able to mitigate that climate incident. Okay. So women often migrate because of scarcity of resources, or desperation rather than voluntary choice. They're making considerations based on the interplay of gender roles and norms and cultural heritage. And then again, going back to the fact that many of them are primary caregivers and also maybe gatherers, particularly in agrarian societies. And then men are more affected by scarcity of employment. So they're more likely to migrate, especially internationally, to find employment. And women, a lot of the women who we see who are fleeing from Central America are fleeing because of a whole series of issues that have occurred. Sometimes it can be first they were internally displaced, but then there was some type of violence against them. It could be family violence, partner violence, or community violence. And then because of the weak institutions within those countries, for example, access to justice, high levels of impunity, they aren't able to access justice and they are still in danger, and so they're having to flee. Okay. This is just a map that shows some of the areas of the world and how we are currently feeling the impact of climate change in different ways. I was just trying to find Indonesia, for example, is one of the ones. Deltas subjected to extreme weather and great surf. I don't know, I saw this map and I thought it was interesting that this pink part here covers Baja California and up and down the coast of Mexico, but for some reason doesn't go into Central America. But you can see here just a tiny little bit of the dry corridor in Central America. Okay. I'm looking at the time. Okay, so this is what we have in the region. Most of the migration through Mexico, into Mexico and through Mexico comes from Honduras now in the last few years, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. Not so much from Nicaragua, because most people from Nicaragua are migrating to Costa Rica. Okay, so in terms of the case study, why Honduras? Honduras because the largest number of people who are requesting asylum in Mexico right now are fleeing from Honduras. And Honduras, I don't know how old you are, but for those of us who are older, we can remember very well when Honduras was hit by Hurricane Mitch in 1998. And it was the deadliest Atlantic hurricane in over 200 years. At that time, 11,000 deaths in Central America and over 7,000 people in Honduras died. And then, I don't know if, excuse me, these kinds of statistics are helpful, but over the long run, what we saw after Hurricane Mitch was that people didn't start to flee immediately after the hurricane. Because first you're in shock, then you want to go back and see where you lived and see the damage that was done to your home and to your community, and see if there's any way that you can rebuild and that you can stay there. And then also, usually, even for refugees, the poorest people aren't the ones who are the first to leave because they're dependent on family members that are in other parts, and so they need to save up enough money to be able to leave, even if it's in a refugee situation. And then in 2020, we saw these three tropical storms, Laura, Eta, and Iota, that were extremely destructive and devastated many communities in Central America and the Caribbean basin. So if you look at, almost 3 million people displaced, and I think in between Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, there are approximately 30 million people in total. So, it's about 10% of the entire population. So we're looking now to see if there are similar results or reactions to the hurricanes in those countries, which was a delayed reaction. But this time around, we also have the pandemic. And so we also, already had a terrible economic situation in Central America, ongoing violence, unstable government institutions, and the whole issue of drought, has been going on for over a decade. And so if you combine all of those things, you can see why people are fleeing from those countries to Mexico, through Mexico, and trying to reach the United States, most of them, not everybody. Okay, so these are just some of the climatic impacts, looking at staple crops, long periods of drought, food insecurity, and you can see that in 2019, already 80% of the harvests had been completely wiped out. So it was, one thing on top of another on top of another. Okay, so these are just some of the examples of coping strategies within Honduras. So people look first to managing water shortages, irrigation systems, famine early warning systems, diversifying crops, effective decision making, when to plant, where to plant, what to plant. These are some of the things that the international development organizations have been working on in Central America. Okay, so this is just one case example of a woman named Cataleya. She's 28 years old from San Pedro Sula, Honduras. She's transgender. She was rejected by her mother, beaten by her brother. And, for transgendered women, they are the most vulnerable group in terms of predatory behavior when by organized crime and just people in general in their trip through Mexico. So first of all, they're suffering in their country of origin due to discrimination, even from their own family. But in the case of this woman, climate change was also another factor. She was already having a difficult time, and then the storm came. So she was able to get a Mexican humanitarian visa to travel to the U.S. border, and she took a bus. But you can see that the violence combined with environmental factors and scarcity of resources left her so desperate that she traveled to the U.S. and requested asylum in the U.S. Okay, I don't know, Gonzalo, did you want me to stop there? Because I know that I just have an hour. I don't know if people wanted to ask questions. The last part is just on some of the mental health concerns of climate change, or the impacts of climate change.
I think that the effects on mental health are quite interesting. So if you don't mind, we'd probably like to listen more.
Okay, I'm almost finished. Okay, so one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about in the organization where I work is, you know, it's enough to have to flee your country because of political persecution. But when it's combined with these long term effects of climate change, I've been living in the dry corridor. First, I was internally displaced. Then I was, persecuted within the city, lots of times in an urban setting. And then I left. Just like, what kind of long term impacts will that have on people in terms of their mental health? And we just, in the last couple of years, have introduced psychological assistance, mental health for all of the women who request legal assistance in our organization, because we found that their mental health is a very important, part of accessing justice, because you have to be stable enough mentally to be able to explain to a judge or to some kind of adjudicator what has happened to you. And then if you do receive asylum in Mexico or in the United States, you need to be mentally stable enough, maybe to seek mental health care, but in order to work and in order to adapt to this new, completely different culture. So, just, some of the issues that we've been reading about, and like I said, we're really just beginning to explore these intersections. Um, but of course, I mean, some of the things I think are pretty obvious. In terms of acute stress reactions, are commonplace after environmental disasters. Depends, of course, on the type of climatic event, the duration and severity of the event. Again, the socioeconomic status, it's not the same if your house is burned down, but you have full insurance and you have family that can take you in and you can get another job, than if everything is absolutely destroyed and no one is going to help you. So networks, family networks, did someone die, as a result of the climate event? And so some of the things I think that back in 1998, and probably because I was ignorant and I should have been thinking about these things, but I wasn't. Um, even a hurricane, surviving a hurricane, causes post-traumatic stress disorder. It can be related to depression, anxiety, suicidal ideations, stress and mood disorders, disrupted sleep, decreased sense of self or identity. And we see that so much with people anyway. So you can imagine now people coming out of Honduras who have basically, been locked up by the government because there were all of these restrictions to their mobility for over a year because of the pandemic. They had curfews. You couldn't go out. You were only allowed to go to the grocery store at certain times. There was no health care. They didn't have access to COVID tests. They don't have vaccinations yet. So you already have the whole impact of the pandemic on your mental health, which I think probably everybody who's listening to this right now, has this sense of isolation and kind of feeling lost sometimes, or like, we've been speaking into our computer screens constantly for 18 months. But imagine if you had that already, and then you had a climate change event that destroyed your home. So it's really important to take care of and to be aware of these mental health issues that come up because of climate change events. Okay, so in terms of the recommendations, I think they're pretty obvious. We've talked about some of them during the presentation, but just the UN and then specific countries are working, it seems like, very hard in making trying to set certain goals for time periods to change over to greener energy sources. But the countries that have more capacity to do that are going to be the countries that are already better set up to mitigate for climate change. So the whole issue of climate migration is going to become more and more pertinent, relevant as we move along. Unfortunately, it seems like things are just going to get worse before they get better, and hopefully they will get better. But we need to have recommendations for states. And I think in some cases, certain development strategies can be used to help countries leap from having maybe no electricity to having green energy. So a lot of those things are being looked at, but in the meantime, people are having to flee, and that's where our work comes in. Okay, there was this example from New Zealand, and these are just some very basic, things. We were trying to think, what can we do as an organization? We can include the information within our information campaigns. We can try to develop better research, know how to talk about the intersection between climate change and migration. We can engage in community outreach. We can advocate and try to include, in legal reforms within the immigration law, or in the Cartagena framework, or in the regional conference on migration, to try to get the states in the region to agree to guarantee protection for people who are fleeing from climate change. We can try to integrate gender and climate change into our legal discourse, and increase our access to social services and livelihood programs, which is something that, in my tiny little organization in Mexico, we haven't been so good about because we don't have very much capacity, but it's something that we need to at least be aware of. Okay, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Gretchen. This was very, very interesting. It seems that it's always the same people who get hit the most, isn't it?
Yeah.
A ver si alguien tiene alguna pregunta, pueden tomar la palabra, pueden hacerla en el chat. Recuerden que para tomar la palabra pueden hacer clic en la parte inferior derecha, y si alguien quiere tomar la palabra para hacer alguna pregunta. Y en lo que a nosotros nos concierne, ¿no? Muchas veces la migración, que es algo de lo que no hablamos con demasiado detalle, también implica una adaptación lingüística a otra cultura, y hacer empezar a vivir en otro idioma y tratar de tener acceso a los servicios sociales en otro idioma. Veo que aquí hay algún mensaje, a ver si es alguna pregunta.
I can't see the message. Can you see it? And
no,
messages?
You're supposed to, you can see them in messages, and I saw it blinking, but apparently there isn't one. Así que,
okay.
Muy bien, pues creo que todo entonces ha quedado muy claro. Creo que nos has dejado, has logrado que los intérpretes guarden silencio, cosa que no es fácil. Los has dejado verdaderamente en es una imagen o un cuadro bastante triste. Y Martín Tapia, tengo un mensaje de Martín Tapia que me lo manda a mí y dice: ¿cuál es el mayor riesgo para los centroamericanos en materia de cambio climático?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's both of the things that are occurring. Central America is an isthmus, so it already has this, situation of drought that's been occurring for decades. And that's something that's going to be ongoing, and that's something that maybe can be mitigated because it's one of those long-term effects. But then the other is this issue of the hurricanes coming every year, which are these dramatic, quick onset events. that destroy, so many homes. And I mean, it seems like that's really where it's so much more difficult to prepare and have better infrastructure in place so that not so many people suffer as a result of those, huge devastating storms. They had 3 within like 3 weeks in November of 2020. Yeah. Yeah, so thank you. I mean, I don't really know very much about using interpreters or what's useful or what's not useful or whether I spoke too quickly, but thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you, even if it's virtually and without being able to see anybody or know exactly who I'm with. But
No, I think it was very interesting, and we have a comment here from Manet saying that it's very interesting to see that migration is one of the effects is not the effects are not only drugs or political issues, which is what we see in the news all the time. That there are other factors that affect migration. And there's another question here on whether you think that the policies and the between the U.S. and Mexico will, for Central America, will they have a positive effect?
yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that the Biden administration and even the Lopez Obrador administration, they both have a better understanding of climate change. They both have a better strategy in terms of knowing that what's needed is development, stronger institutions, infrastructure, moving against corruption, the same thing that's happening or that should be happening in Mexico. But of course, just like all political structures, it's so much more difficult to implement in these short political times that are available to people when when they have the administration. And climate change is something that needs to be consistent and needs to be, it can't be changed between a 4-year or an 8-year administration in the US and a 6-year administration in Mexico. So I think that's one of the issues that have come up, like the policies of the Trump administration were diametrically opposed to what Biden would like to do. But that doesn't help anybody if you invest a lot of money and then 8 years later you stop, you pull out all of the funds and then 8 years later you start over again. That's, not helpful. So, but I think that right now we're in a better position because we have 2 administrations who at least are thinking in the same way. Now I can't hear you.
God, yeah. I keep forgetting to turn my microphone on.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think that I'm glad that we finished on a happy note, and hopefully these 2 administrations will work together, and we will have there will be some positive effect. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you for taking the time in the middle of your holiday, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your vacation. And we are very, very grateful for this very, very interesting conversation.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Goodbye. Thank you very much.
Bye.